today, and it's a story about the Leave Me Alone Coalition. There was a guy a couple hundred years ago in England. His name was John Wilkes, and he was said to be a libertine. He was said to be a hellraiser. I don't know about his morals, I don't know what he was doing, but I do know that he was a gadfly to the king. Everywhere the king went, John Wilkes went. Every time the king said something, John Wilkes responded. John Wilkes went a little too far when he compared the prime minister to prostitution. Got him in hot water, so the king, through the prime minister, issued a warrant for his arrest. Only thing is, he didn't put John Wilkes' name on the warrant. He wrote a general warrant. This general warrant said, just go get anybody that you think might be linked to a crime. The crime was writing an op-ed the king didn't like. So they went breaking down doors. They broke down the doors of John Wilkes' house. They rifled through his contents. They took his stuff. They trashed his place. And they put him in shackles and threw him in the Tower of London. But John Wilkes was in the Parliament, so they finally let him out because there was a law that said you can't arrest members of Parliament. He goes out and he decides to do something extraordinary. Sue the king. So he sues the king, and lo and behold, he wins. He wins £1,000, which is now the equivalent of $700,000 in today's dollars. He wins because the king didn't have his name on a warrant. The king had what was called a generalized warrant, and this is 1763. And even in those days, in England, they said they had to put your name on the warrant. You think we could still learn something from that today? Across the Atlantic in our country was James Otis. James Otis was fighting against in court, against the king's lawyers, but fighting against something they called writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were also general warrants. They were warrants that had no one's name on them. They also were written by the soldiers. Sounds a little bit like national security letters. These were warrants written by the soldiers, but why did they have to have blanket warrants? Because they wanted to come into the colonists' home. They wanted to see if their papers were stamped. The colonists hated the stamp tax, but they came to their house to see if they'd paid the stamp tax. But they didn't have a warrant with anyone's name on it. And we were angry, we were upset. And James Otis took it to court. And John Adams said that James Otis in that courtroom, John Adams was there watching the court proceedings, he said that that day, James Otis set the spark, released the energy that became the American Revolution, that became this great country of ours. Well, the founders governed writing the Constitution and adding the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment was a big deal. One of the most important things of the Fourth Amendment is that it is individualized. You have to write someone's name on the warrant. You can't just say, I want every American's phone record. You're supposed to write an individual's name. And those of us who believe in liberty and freedom, we're not against the government getting your information. But they have to have your name on the warrant. They have to have probable cause. They have to say what they want, and they have to ask a judge for this. It's these checks and balances where you don't put all the power in one place. Why don't we put the power in one place? Why do we separate to have checks and balances? Because there have been times in our history when we did the wrong thing. There have been times in our history when the color of your skin dictated the way the government responded to you. The checks and balances are to protect you against bias. There have been times when we didn't do it the correct way. So we had the Fourth Amendment. Everything was going great. We did pretty well with it, maybe 100 years or so. Then technology came. We got the telephone. By the 20s, a lot of people have telephones. We also have something else. The government trying to tell us what to do. We have prohibition. The government saying there can be no alcohol. They couldn't find victims for these crimes, but they created a crime. But in creating the crime, they said, we got to go out and find these people who are selling alcohol against the law. So they found a guy named Ray Olmsted. This becomes the Olmsted case of 1928. They arrest him. They eavesdrop on his phone calls, and they go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, your phone calls aren't yours. Your conversations are not yours. But there's a famous dissent to the time. It's a terrible decision. It's the Olmsted case, 1928. It says you have no right to your privacy. You have no right to protect your phone calls. But in that case, Justice Brandeis objects. He writes the dissent, and in the dissent he says that the right to be left alone is among the most cherished rights. It is the most prized of rights. On that day, Brandeis is outvoted, and they say you don't have protection for your telephone calls. 40 years later, though, the issue's revisited in the late 1960s, in the Katz case, and they say, you know what? We've changed our mind. You do get the protection of your phone calls. It was a big reversal. We don't see reversals like that often, but it's one of the few things that can happen in a republic. You don't always inexorably lose your liberty. Sometimes you can get it back. So we grasped and we got some back. But then in the late 1970s, there's another case, and they say, well, what about your phone records? Not just your phone conversations. What about the records of your phone calls? And the government ruled in this case, and unfortunately this is still the law, that your phone records get no protection. But here's the problem. This is the debate we're going to have in our country, the debate we are having, and that I want you to be part of, is that the government can tell an enormous amount of things from your records. 2 Stanford students put an app on a phone to voluntarily see what they could figure out just by recording some volunteers' phone calls, the duration and who you called. 85% of the time they can tell your religion. Nearly 100% of the time they can tell your doctor. 75% of the time they can tell what disease you were going to just by the frequency of your visits and which doctor you went to. Think about it. Our records are part of us. Our records are ours. Think about your visa bill. If I have your visa bill, I can tell whether you drink, whether you smoke, and how much. I can tell whether you gamble. I can tell whether you read magazines, what magazines you read. It's none of the government's business. In the 70s, and we go from the 70s to the present, and it's still uncertain, but the current law of the land is your records aren't protected by the 4th Amendment. So we have this debate going on, and about a year ago, the head of the intelligence is brought before the Senate committee, James Clapper. He's brought before the committee and he's asked, are you collecting in bulk the records of all Americans, or of a significant amount of Americans, of millions of Americans? And he said no. But he lied. And we would have never known about the lie except for Snowden revealed the report. But here's the thing about the warrant. Warrants should have someone's name on it. Do you know what the name that was on the warrant that Snowden revealed? It says Verizon. I don't know anybody named Mr. Verizon. And I don't think it's consistent with the 4th Amendment to have a company's name on there and collect millions and millions and millions of phone records from people who there is no suspicion of a crime and no justified warrant. I think it should stop, and I want to be part of stopping it. And some days I feel like John Wilkes. I just like to stand up to the king, and so I sued the king. Oh, that's what we're on. I sued President Obama. And I sued to say that the warrant to collect my phone calls and your phone calls is unconstitutional. What I do on my phone, what you do on your phone, and your phone records, I say it's none of the government standards. Well, good news. Yesterday, we hear that the appellate court one step below the Supreme Court rules. Guess what? What they've been doing is illegal. And things aren't ever what they say. The President's Privacy Commission told him what he was doing was not appropriate and he shouldn't do it. And so he said, oh yes, I've listened to my Privacy Commission, and if Congress changes the law, I'll listen to them. All of this was started by executive order. If I become president on day one, I'll end it all. Now you will hear some voices, some of them emanating from Arizona, that say, well, how will you catch terrorists? One of them came up to me and they said, well, if the Patriot expires, what will we do? And I said, maybe we could rely on the Constitution for a few years. Think about it. You had a homegrown terrorist from Phoenix that was involved in a shooting. We knew his name. We had investigated him, but maybe we're spending so damn much time on innocent people that we're not spending enough time going after the perpetrators. The Boston Marathon bomber, we knew his name too. Here's the thing is, you can get terrorists, you can go after criminals, you can get rapists, you can get murderers, get a warrant. It's not that hard. If there's a rapist in Phoenix tonight and they're inside their house and you haven't seen them go in, the police show up, the police do the appropriate thing. They stand on the curb, they call a judge at 3 in the morning, and it's almost never turned down. But the reason we do it, the reason we have a process, is not because we think the police are bad, not because we think that we do it for the protection of the checks and balances, so you don't wind up with bias, or you don't make rash decisions, or you don't get somebody who says, I don't like black people, or I don't like gay people, or I don't like evangelical Christians. You don't get somebody that can inflict their bias by having these checks and balances. I had this debate with a certain senator from a certain state that starts with an A. And it was about whether or not an American citizen could be detained without a trial. So we're going back and forth on the Senate floor, and I say, surely you wouldn't send an American citizen to Guantanamo Bay without a trial? And he said, yeah, if they're dangerous. I say, it sort of begs the question, who gets to decide if they're dangerous?
Yeah!
So he has a sidekick from a state that starts with an S. The sidekick's there, and the sidekick says, well, when they ask you for a lawyer, you just tell them to shut up.
Shut up, you don't get a lawyer.
That's the level of what we're talking about. Used to be once upon a time we talked about innocent until proven innocent. Remember Richard Jewell? Richard Jewell, everybody thought he was the Olympic bomber. He fit the profile, he had glasses, he was an introvert, he had a backpack. My goodness, that's a lot of people. So the media convicted him immediately. In fact, later they had to pay him millions of dollars because it wasn't the right guy. He didn't do the bombing. They actually caught the guy who did the bombing. But imagine if Richard Jewell had been a black man in the South in the 1920s, what would have happened to him? That's why we have these rules. So bias doesn't enter into it, and so you don't have innocent people being murdered and harmed. We have due process so the innocent get their day in court. People ask me, how are we going to get young people involved? How are we going to win in these states that are going Democrat, these states that are more independent? And I say, you know what? We need to be the party that defends the entire Bill of Rights. That's right. When we do, when we become the party that defends the entire Bill of Rights, things are going to be different. Every Republican seems to be good with the Second Amendment. I'm for it too. I'm a big defender of the Second Amendment. got to defend the Fourth Amendment. You got to defend the First Amendment.
President Paul! President Paul!
The other thing we have to do, though, is we have to realize in our country there are some problems. There's, I call it an undercurrent of unease, and sometimes it's not so much an undercurrent. There's a lot of unhappiness. Some of it's emanating from our big cities. Some of it's emanating from areas where there's an enormous amount of poverty. There's an enormous amount of criminal injustice going on. And I'll tell you a story to give you an idea of why some people in our country are unhappy. Kelli Ward was a 16-year-old black kid in the Bronx. He was arrested and accused of a crime. I don't know if he committed a crime. The person who accused him actually was in the country illegally and actually fled. But he was kept in jail for 3 years. 3 years. He was put in solitary confinement. He never had a trial. He tried to commit suicide. His bail was $3,000. Most of your parents would have gotten you out. $3,000. They couldn't afford it. But he tried to commit suicide several times. That shouldn't happen in our country. The Sixth Amendment says you have a right to a trial, but it also says you have a right to a speedy trial. So when you see people unhappy in our country, there is no excuse for rioting. There is no excuse for throwing rocks at the police. But when you see this sort of seething unhappiness, this seething discontent, realize that if you were Kelli's parents or his neighbor or his friends, how he must have felt to be in jail for 3 years without a trial. And let's try to have some compassion, and let's try to fix the criminal justice system. There will be differences among the Republicans, and I don't think we're going to have too much trouble finding differences. But the thing is that some of the differences are worth talking about. And I'll tell you one of the differences is whether or not we should always intervene overseas, or whether sometimes, if not more than often, it's been a mistake. I grew up in a Republican family. I was there in 1976 when my family was there to support Reagan. I am a Reagan Republican through and through. If Reagan believed in something that's sometimes misrepresented and distorted by people in our party, Reagan believed in peace through strength. Reagan didn't always believe that intervention was the answer.
That's right.
A little over a year ago, Hillary and the President decided it was a good idea to be part of the war in Libya. I call it Hillary's war in Libya.
Yep.
And the thing is that I don't think it made us more safe. I think it made us less safe.
That's right.
So you've got a few loudmouths in our party saying, oh, but you support President Obama's foreign policy. The exact opposite is the truth. They supported the war in Libya. They supported sending arms to the Islamic rebels in Syria. They have supported every one of these wars that's come down, and we've gotten the wrong outcome. We're less safe. There's more jihadists. There's more radical Islam and more problems because we topple secular governments and we get radical religious governments.
That's right.
If we want to be the party that represents all of America, we want to be the party that can win the 18 states Republicans haven't won in 30 years, we need to be the party that passionately represents and passionately proclaims the entire Bill of Rights. We need to be the party that proclaims a vision and puts it forward with an optimism that resonates through the land. We need to be the party that understands, you know what? There is no monopoly of knowledge in Washington, and we ought to limit everyone their knowledge. party that says, you know what? We bring in $3.3 trillion. Why don't we just spend $3.3 trillion? Party that says, for goodness sakes, out and read the damn bills first. I was there one day, and they delivered a 1,000-page bill. No one read it. We had about 2 hours till we had to vote on it. And I looked at the Senate rules. I had just gotten there. I looked at the Senate rules, and it said you have to wait 48 hours. And so I made a point of order. I said, you're breaking your own rules. So they just voted to change the rules. Nobody reads the bills. Remember Nancy Pelosi? She said you can read about it after it's passed. This is the problem. The other problem that compounds it is most of the rules aren't even voted on. Most of them are done by executive fiat. They're done by imperial directive from the president. The thing is, we've let too much power gravitate to the president. If we want to win again, if we want to be the nationally dominant party, if we want our ideas to resonate from coast to coast, we need to proclaim our message with the passion of Patrick Henry, but also with optimism. I love the image that Robert Henry, the painter, talked about. He said, paint like a man coming over the hill singing. When we're the party that proclaims our message like a man coming over the hill singing, then we'll win again. Thank you very much.